We stand at the very lip of a long-remembered bay, and there is, at once, a small, private astonishment, the kind that arrives when one finds an old book in an unfamiliar hand and recognizes the margin note as one's own. It is a curious fact that coasts keep their patience. They have the modest ritual of waiting until we have come to listen. Stay with us, for what follows is quiet and deliberate, and it asks only that we remain until the tide has finished its sentence. The first breath of this place is cool and medicinal, sea salt folded with limestone and the faint dust of sun-warmed thyme. Gulls, like punctuation, appear and are gone. We will go no faster than the sea allows. We promise a slow revealing, small shapes at first, then a hesitant line, then at last the suggestion of order where once there was only scatter. Breathe with the pull of the water. Let our lungs match the tide and notice how the chest softens as the sea pulls in and lets go. Imagine the light as a thin green veil drawn slowly over the world, light that lets objects keep some of their reserve. In that guarded light, things suggest themselves rather than shout. A pair of stones lean as if speaking to each other. A darker curve hints at a circle. A shadow falls like an old answer. We name nothing yet. Naming is a later courtesy. For now, notice texture. The quick crackle of pebbles, the low susurration of current over sand, the tiny, secret sound of a barnacle giving hold. We ask a modest favor of our attention. Follow a specific sound with us, the tide moving across a shallow shelf, and see how the mind settles to its measurement. This is a sound that keeps time as a watch keeps hours. It is steady and unremarked until one listens for it, and then it feels like the truest thing in the world. Let the rhythm of that sound be the measure of our breathing. There is a scholar's hush here. One might picture a marginal note in an old ledger, a fisherman's name half fading, a small hand-drawn map with a corner rubbed soft. We are companions in a quiet inquiry rather than prosecutors of truth. We fold down corners, we lift pebbles, we place them back with the same care. These gestures are small and kind, and they teach patience. Our attention narrows gently to the first visible mysteries, not grand revelations but intimate hints. A line of stones like sleeping vertebrae, the scalloped lip of a carved slab, a place where eelgrass parts as if to admit an old secret. Each detail is given fully time to be seen. We describe only so much as will let the listener imagine the rest. In this way, curiosity relaxes into companionship and wonder wanes into a comfortable knowledge. Bring the body into this imagining. Feel the cool of a stone beneath your palm. Sense the slight give of sand underfoot. Notice shoulders dropping as if some invisible knot between them has loosened. These are the small bodily cues that let the mind come home to itself. We encourage a matching breath now, long in as the tide comes, long out as it goes. We will keep conversation low and close to texture. The voice we use is that of someone reading by lamplight, not declaiming from a pulpit. Vocabulary is chosen for touch and weight rather than for drama. Long vowels, soft consonants, and pauses that let images bloom and fade. Each long pause invites the listener to imagine a detail and then to let it drift away. Now, as the first blue-thin light slips over a tucked line of stones, we sense the promise of a story that will not hurry us. An hour of careful attention, small discoveries, and an invitation to be quiet. If you follow until the end, there will be a small, intimate consolation. Nothing sensational, only the gentle comprehension that some things remain beautiful precisely because they were not hurried. Stay with us. Let the sea be steady under your awareness, and the story will be a kind companion. There is a small promise folded into the middle of our hour, not a sudden revelation but a tender, private recognition, like finding a pressed wildflower in the corner of an old atlas. We will follow that quiet thread as if it were a seam, attentive to its texture and grateful for its modesty. Midway, the stones will show a slight ordering, and we will, Together, step closer without urgency. These gentle hooks are what keep a listener leaning in while remaining calm. The possibility that an ordinary object, a child's carved peg, a thumb-smooth bead, can speak across centuries in the intimate language of touch. If you stay until the end, that small object will be allowed to keep its privacy. It will offer only a soft, human echo rather than spectacle. Hold that expectation like a warm pebble in your palm, and return, again, to the tide's steady counting. Stay with us, the sea will. We lay the map between us. Not the inked one, but an imagined map breathes with the smell of old paper and salt. Harbor is first in our day. The creak of a rope, the soft knock of a hull easing against a wooden quay. Men and women moving with practiced patience as if time itself were a well-worn net. From the quay we can hear the clang of an oar against a post, the small argument of gulls, the distant call of a child who keeps count of nets and shells. These are the overtures of morning light and labor. We follow that morning along an avenue of oaks that once ran behind the houses, a cool lane where leaves make a slow, papery hush underfoot. Imagine carts that move like thought, deliberate, slow, each wheel's whisper carried into the warm air. Under an oak's shade the world takes on a quieter temperature. One might suppose the sun itself leans down to listen. The hearth is a center we visit twice in the day, bread being turned, a pot that breathes steam like a small tide, the careful hands that move in righted rhythm. There is the domestic music of a village, a spoon's soft ring, the folded cloth, the murmur of an elder recounting a season's catch. We learn a day by such gestures. We learn how ordinary life builds its own slow architecture of care. Between these moments lies the tidal plain, that liminal tongue of land that answers to the moon. In certain hours the plain is a mirror of sky. In others it is the sea's soft carpet, rich with the tracks of birds and the faint, silver smell of seaweed. Who walks there at dusk? Who lays down a small offering of shell, a shard, a leaf? These small questions hang like low birds above the water. We are careful to reconstruct not as historians of certainty, but as companions in inquiry. Scholars aside, one might catalog dates and tithe names and still not feel the warmth of a hand that mended a net. So we proceed with sounds and small domestic textures rather than lists of rulers or edicts. The point is to feel the shape of a day, the slow arcs of labor and rest. Listen, the harbor's sound changes through hours, a low chorus of voices at morning, the clink of tools midday, a hush as lanterns are lit in the evening. The Oak Avenue keeps its own register. Early light is thin and green, noon is a slow heat, and the late shadow tastes of salt. The hearth carries the human scale. Close to it, all measures are simple and immediate. We will touch the tactile, a rope's fray, the coarse weave of a fisherman's garment, the rounded edge of a bowl worn by many hands. These are not dramatic objects. They are the comfortable furnishings of ordinary endurance. Feeling them in our hands binds us to the community, as though a single seam of labor links each life. There is a sustained wonder that threads these set pieces together, how habit becomes a kind of architecture, how repeated small actions can shape the contours of living as surely as a mason-shaped stone. Could it be that the stones we later find beneath the water are a fossilized echo of such habits? We keep that thought like a soft thread through our day, allowing it to pull gently at the corners of recollection. Our body is invited into this imagining. Feel the warmth of the hearth against your palms as if you hold a small bowl. Let the breeze along the Oak Avenue cool the back of your neck. Sense the give of the tidal plain beneath your feet as the water moves in with patient hands. These gestures are small reset points, anchors that bring us, again and again, into the present frame of the day. Breathe in with the harbor's opening, exhale with the hearth's settling. We include the quieter, marginal sounds because they are truthful, the creak of a ladder, the tiny scuff of a child's foot behind a door, the rustle of seagrass pulled by a passing cart. Each sound is a stitch in the daily cloth, and together they make a fabric that can be read if we are tender with it. We read for rhythm rather than for chronology. At midday, there is always a small ceremonial pause. The net is checked, knots are made and remade. A phrase is repeated that keeps watch over the day's labor. Such small rituals sustain a community. They are the scaffolding of ordinary permanence. The sustained wonder is this: how such modest ritual can endure across seasons and, perhaps, across the slow erasures time will impose. Finally, as the light thins and the harbor settles into its evening register, we perceive the day folding itself into memory. Lanterns appear like slow constellations. Voices lower their kernels of song. The oak avenue gathers shadow and seems to listen. We close this brief day not with a summation, but with gratitude for having been invited to walk such a slow, human pace. We move closer now, together, until the shapes that were once only suggestion become a circle of stones lying under a slow green light, a scatter that, to patient eyes, reads almost like intention. There is a particular hush about circles. They ask for company and for ordering, and they keep their counsel. What did those hands mean when they raised the nearest stone? Was it a marker, a hearth, a gathering place, or simply the neatness of someone who enjoyed arranging? One theory suggests a patient return. These stones were once inland, adored and used for steady rituals, and the sea, in a long, indifferent temper, arrived inch by inch until habit and land found themselves in new relation. Imagine a village whose boundary is rewritten over centuries. What seemed permanent grows moss, then salt, and finally a marine varnish. Could slow swallowing be the most merciful disappearance, allowing memory to settle like silt? Another possibility is the sudden inlet, a night when earth gave way or a storm cleaved the coast and a harbor became a gulf. There are old accounts, half-remembered, recorded in margins, that speak of a single season, bells no longer where they had hung, a street gone beneath a night smelling of iron. If such things happen, what does the world lose? Do we lose only property, or the habit of calling children by certain names? A third thought is, gently and humanly, undoing by degrees. A community that left in stages, taking portable goods and repurposing what they could, leaving heavy stones to the patience of the sea. People take what warms their hands. They leave the ballast. How often do we, for practical or hopeful reasons, choose to abandon that which weighs most? We do not prefer any theory. Instead, we keep them as companionable possibilities, each with its own texture. The patient return tastes of time and earned age. The sudden inlet carries the metallic tang of storm and grief. The slow undoing is domestic, the sound of men folding sails and mothers wrapping jars. Together they form a small chorus rather than a verdict. Between these larger possibilities are smaller intimacies of disappearance. The last morning, when someone left a bowl cooling too long on a ledge, the way a child's game might pause and never resume. Consider a toy left on a windowsill, its paint softening in sun. When buried and water-worn, such a thing becomes the most insistent proof of presence. We are always moved by such proofs. They are the salt that preserves the human taste in any archaeological record. We linger on the human gestures that might have accompanied such departures. Fingers tightening a knot with habitual care, a woman pausing in a doorway to turn once toward a courtyard that will become sea, a child hiding a small wooden toy beneath straw and later forgetting the secret place. Memory is often domestic in scale. It keeps its records in the cadence of daily chores rather than carved proclamations. In imagining such small acts, we give shape to the departure without dramatizing and softly. It is here, between theories and anecdote, that the ziggurat motif rises like a private chapel, a stepped form beneath the waves, terraces worn by silt, an inner chamber that keeps its own whisper. We approach with care, not as conquerors, but as guests. We step from the outer ring into a center where sound and space change. There is a different acoustic inside such forms. Water hums against concavity, and the ear notices this as if given a small secret. Let us put our hands, for a moment in thought, upon the low wall of the ziggurat and feel how the stone has been polished by salt and hands. The topmost step may be populated with small shells turned white by long sleep. The mortar between courses bears the faint impression of a thumb or cord. Feel beneath our toes, too, the cool clay that clings like memory to the soles. The body registers that we are participants in a tactile world. Inside the inner chamber, less a dramatic room than a folded space, we find, at last, an object. It is small, unprepossessing, a child's carved peg, a wooden thing smoothed by fingers that no longer warm it. The peg smells faintly of brine and resin, and at its center is the worn crescent of a thumb. Such a mark, so ordinary, gives us a terrible consolation, that lives here were ordinary and exacting and therefore beautiful. This chamber moment is not a revelation like a headline. It is a quiet answer to a quiet question. The object's voice is texture rather than inscription. It says, across centuries, that hands fiddled and fixed, that someone repaired what could be repaired, that small domestic music persisted even as larger shapes changed. We feel, in the finding, a soft pang, the intimacy of ordinary loss. Alternate intimacies appear elsewhere. A doorway where a basket lay, a hearthstone that holds a ring of salt where water licked and receded, a fragment of ceramic whose glaze catches light like a forgotten eye. Each offers the same tiny consolation as the peg, proof of small ongoing life rather than catastrophe. We collect these small proofs in our speech like pebbles in a pocket. There is also a Clarke-like ambiguity to respect. Evidence admits multiple readings, and too easy certainty is unkind. Scholars aside, to prefer one tidy explanation over patient plurality is to diminish both sea and people. Instead, we allow the mystery to keep its borders soft. Each reading becomes companionship rather than verdict. Rhetorical questions hang, deliberately, so that silence can answer them. How does a place become sacred? Is it by arrangement of stone or by repetition of small acts? We leave these open, not to frustrate curiosity, but to allow the listener's mind a gentle field to wander without needing an answer. We also notice acoustic textures of disappearance. The way water softens edges, the clink of a dropped coin becomes a muffled pulse. The distant machine's sonar sings a note that feels like a reminder rather than discovery. These stitch modern sound to ancient quiet and make the scene feel, oddly, like two hands touching beneath a sheet. In closing, we bring the listener's body back into company. Feel the weight of the peg in our imagined palm. Sense the cool clay under our toes. Notice how our breath has lengthened without choice. These tiny returns are breaks and beds both. They keep the mind from wandering too fast and invite the chest to settle to the rhythm the stones have set. Let the questions remain like soft pebbles in a still hand, each felt and released. We follow the shore's slow ledger into modern measurements. Tide marks faintly graffitied on old walls. A farmer's stone oven half buried where fields once were. A small notch cut into a quay that reads like a fossil. The map becomes patient arithmetic. We speak of millimeters and seasons as if naming them helps the world settle into a readable rhythm. There is a careful pleasure in such numbers. They tell a slow story of inches won and inches lost, and they ask us to listen. Instruments enter the tale with unostentatious sounds, a tide gauge that ticks like a low mechanical heart, a sonar sweep that paints the seabed in blue-gray strokes, the wet click of a camera as a diver lifts a photograph and finds a shape where none was expected. These are modern textures, the lab's steady whir, the hollow ping of sonar returning from a buried stone, the rasp of neoprene against a hull. Each new sound becomes a small astonishment that translates surprise into a practical question. Remember the net snag, an ordinary morning when a fisher, guiding his boat over a shallow shelf, feels a resistance that should not be. He hauls the net and a face of stone appears where he expected only silt. The tug is the sea's first, modest voice. Such moments are human and ordinary. A practical problem becomes an invitation to wonder. The first photograph is modest and honest, a grainy image of a curved stone edge caught in a diver's torch. The picture moves from boat to lab, to cafe notice board, to a small museum panel. Its circulation is the modern way of saying, "Look here." We follow such images with careful appetite and note how astonishment spreads along familiar routes. Sonar blips have their own music, a clean ping followed by a rounded return that sounds like a heartbeat at the bottom of the world. Technicians learn to read these notches as if they were letters. A long sustain might be a boulder, a thin repeat a row of stacked stones. We describe the sound so the listener feels the tools brushing ancient edges. A diver's reach is tactile, a gloved hand passing through cold water, fingers finally touching stone that has been warmed by algae and time. The diver's breath hisses in a regulator. The mask fogs slightly. A torch beam draws a private map where a chipped curve or an incised line becomes legible. There is a private wonder in that brief contact. At the lab table, the field's surprise becomes archival care. A photograph is examined, metadata logged, coordinates noted, a fragment rinsed and left to dry on blotting paper. The quiet machinery of science is domestic in its gentleness. Pipettes like small spoons, label pens that look like pencils, gloved hands folding a shard into tissue with an unexpected tenderness. Rituals of measurement transform surprise into steady knowledge. Public walks attend private discovery. A small notice at the quay, a tentative year on a plaque, a local guide pointing out where fishermen once tied their boats. People who pass daily fold the new knowledge into their maps. Children learn the stones at beach parties. Elders recall the shoreline before the water came. The community's memory becomes the final instrument of recognition. Tenderness arises in the juxtaposition of lab light and harbor habit. The scientist's measured note and the fisherwoman's remembered rhymes speak in the same chorus. Measurement without memory is brittle. Memory without measurement may drift. Together they form a softer comprehension that holds both precision and feeling. Attend to acoustic textures because they anchor our bodies. The sonar's ping is brief and clean. The camera's shutter a small click like a bead dropped into a bowl. The lab's refrigerator hum a steady companion. Place these sounds in your awareness and let them measure breath. Inhale on the sonar ping. Exhale on the camera click. Let the refrigerator's hum steady your middle. Small physical cues bring the present into our bodies as we listen. A private discovery deserves quiet pause. Imagine a technician alone in a dim room, holding a washed fragment under a lamp. He traces the glaze through a glove and finds, impressed faintly into the clay, a child's deliberate scratch, perhaps a counting mark, perhaps a game. The technician pauses, his hand stills. He breathes with the exact pleasure of someone given a human voice from far away. We return to the shoreline where discovery becomes public memory. A morning lecture at the quay, a grandmother taking a child's hand to point at the place grandfather used to drag his nets. Such moments fold the scientific into the human and make the rediscovery communal rather than merely curious. It is in this slow handover that a site truly becomes part of a living map. The timeline feels braided. Ledger notes loop with sonar charts. Grainy photographs sit beside GPS coordinates. Fishermen's names appear beside lab accession numbers. The braid need not be tidy. It is pleasing that multiple registers may live side by side, each offering a different frequency of attention. Allow this braided cadence to soothe rather than demand. Bring attention back to the body. Feel the quickening palm when a net snags, the steadiness of a hand at the lab bench, the softened shoulders of someone listening on a public walk. These human rhythms accompany knowledge. Let them pace our breathing as we move from surprise toward comprehension. We hold the washed fragment gently, like a pebble in the palm, and the cool weight reminds us of how small discoveries anchor us. We carry these small recognitions forward, tenderly, and let them nest in the larger patient story the sea continues to compose around stone and time. We turn from stone and tide to the human harmonics that gather around them. Small songs, half-remembered prayers, the ways a people lends voice to place. There is a low communal sound here, laughter on a harbor wind, the scrape of oars, the measured cadence of voices folding cloth and mending nets. Listen, and you will hear these as a kind of chorus, an answering pattern to the stones beneath the water. Imagine bread piled upon a windowsill and a trivial rhyme sung to keep children from running near the quay. That rhyme may later become a fisherman's lament when the sea takes more than fish. Who becomes keeper of songs? Who passes them at dusk beside an ember or over a low wall where wind carries words? Votive offerings are small and private. A shard tucked beneath a stone, a ribbon knotted to a post, a pebble polished in a pocket then placed on a ledge. Such acts read as domestic prayers. They are steady insistences that something continue. Stones listen to these insistences and sometimes keep them. Myth and work entwine. Sea mothers appear in lullabies as careful guardians of nets. Stone keepers act as neighbors who balance accounts rather than rulers. These are not dramatic gods, but conversational presences suited to village scale. Is mythness then measured by scale rather than intensity? Names matter. An inlet called Folded Light carries a different temper than one named for a battle. Scholars aside, place names are among the oldest archives. They live in speech before maps. The oral archive keeps what people need and quietly discards what no longer serves. Lullabies and funeral songs overlap like embroidered patterns, one motif for play, another variant for loss. The music is spare, a repeated interval, a verse that alters its end to make room for grief or thanks. Such melodies are designed to be remembered at low energy, fitting tired voices. Boundary curses function as social technologies. Do not take more than needed, or remember the long swell. These phrases help a community negotiate fragility. Think of them not as superstition, but as slow, conversational law. Folk characters walk the coast. The stone mender who knew where to rest a slab. The child who counted pebbles. The old woman reading tides from gulls. These figures personify habit so endurance can be taught like a tale. They make practical memory imaginable. Feel the domestic textures that anchor myths. A rope's fray warmed by hand, the soft heft of a loaf in a basket, a child's bead catching salt light. Each object carries a storyline. Each storyline is a thread in a larger weave. Imagine a child's game on a shore becoming, across generations, a ritual of remembrance. Stories move between registers, whispered at night, sung while hauling a net, noted in a ledger by a clerk. They change emphasis as they cross from private memory to public commemoration. The scholar hears data, the neighbor hears companionship. Lullabies and funeral songs overlap like embroidered patterns, one motif for play, another variant for loss. The music is spare, a repeated interval, a verse that alters its end to make room for grief or thanks. Such melodies are designed to be remembered at low energy, fitting tired voices. Boundary curses function as social technologies. Do not take more than needed, or remember the long swell. These phrases help a community negotiate fragility. Think of them not as superstition, but as slow, conversational law. Folk characters walk the coast. The stone mender who knew where to rest a slab. The child who counted pebbles. the old woman reading tides from gulls. These figures personify habit so endurance can be taught like a tale. They make practical memory imaginable. Feel the domestic textures that anchor myths. A rope's fray warmed by hand, the soft heft of a loaf in a basket, a child's bead catching salt light. Each object carries a storyline. Each storyline is a thread in a larger weave. Imagine a child's game on a shore becoming, across generations, a ritual of remembrance. Stories move between registers, whispered at night, sung while hauling a net, noted in a ledger by a clerk. They change emphasis as they cross from private memory to public commemoration. The scholar hears data, the neighbor hears companionship. There are modest public rites too, a slow, annual turning of stones where villagers follow the high tide line, press a thumb to a named rock, and whisper a thanks. These rituals are small and lunar-timed. They stitch private memory into a communal seam and remind newcomers which edges to mind. Observance need not be loud to be binding. Notice how recipes travel: a salted fish, a preserved tart, the exact way an elder folds dough. Food keeps the shore in the mouth and hands across years. Culinary memory is a quiet ledger. It passes place into new palms and instructions. Is there any intimacy stranger and closer than sharing a preserved taste with someone who remembers the same shore? We end without concluding the lore. We gather a few motifs: lullaby, boundary curse, practical myth, and let them hang like a garland over the stones. They are company more than explanation, sitting softly with the idea that life continued here in ordinary and mythic ways. Hold these motifs gently as our attention softens and we move onward. We let ourselves drift a little higher in the water, just enough that the full ring of stones rests below us like a thought not yet spoken. The light here is diffuse, a pale wash filtered through wandering currents, and it lets us see the shapes without insisting on them. This is where our quieter speculations begin, not as conclusions, but as soft threads we lay down beside one another, each allowed its own unhurried breath. The first thought arrives in the form of a shadow. We watch how the stones cast it, long, slanting, a slow dark finger pointing toward a direction that once mattered. We follow it only with our eyes. There are scholars who have suggested that such alignments were intentional, markers of a midwinter sunrise, perhaps, or the rising of a star whose name has been forgotten. But we speak the idea with the same softness that the tide speaks over the sand, gently, without urgency, knowing that the sky those builders once read has shifted many times since their hands last touched these megaliths. We place a small lantern on an imagined shelf of stone in our minds, its glow warming the thought. If the stones once tracked a season, the lantern would have been unnecessary. The people who stood here would have known the sky like a relative. We let that awareness breathe. Perhaps this circle was not for calculation at all, but for gathering, a marker of when a community came together simply because the air changed, or the sea turned a deeper shade, or the first fish of a migration glittered in nets along this once dry shore. A second theory glides toward us with the slow grace of a drifting leaf of kelp. This one imagines tides themselves as the central element. We picture a line of inhabitants watching the water rise and fall, day after day, year after year, until they understood the shoreline's moods with an intimacy we have lost. One can imagine them marking a particular high tide with a particular stone. Here the sea reached after the storm of the elder winter. Or, here the sea withdrew so far that children could run on sand that now lies beneath 3 fathoms of green-blue hush. We see it in the way one stone tilts slightly inward, as though leaning toward the basin it once observed. We do not push this idea to certainty. We rest with it. A circle of stones might have served as a slow ledger of water, a memory keeper of the coastline, a quiet monument to the patience required to understand a world that shifts grain by grain. Another possibility comes to us the way old linen pages whisper when turned. We imagine a journal on an excavation table somewhere above the waves, edges curled from years of handling, a faint scent of dust and sea salt rising when opened. A theory recorded there might propose that this arrangement of stones carried ritual significance. But the word ritual often tries too hard. Here, we let it relax. Ritual as in meeting place. Ritual as in the ordinary practice of sharing a meal at dusk. Ritual as in a moment chosen to acknowledge the passing of a season, or the memory of someone beloved, or the first harvest of barley carried in hand-woven baskets from a village long dissolved into the sea. We let the theory stay small, not a grand temple, not a lost cult, just a place where people once stood side by side, breathing the same air we now share underwater, listening to the same slow wind that must have passed through whatever coastal settlement stood here. The stones, then, would not need to be elaborate to matter. Their weight, their placement, their companionship with one another, these could have been enough. We drift around the circle, keeping our movements unhurried. A gentle tap of a fingertip against a stone, imagined, never intrusive, reveals how thickly silt has clothed it. The vibration is muted, almost tender. It reminds us how archaeology, at its most careful, is not an act of removal, but an act of listening. The silt, in its kindness, has preserved these shapes longer than human hands ever could. Another soft hypothesis unfurls like a ribbon in slow current. Perhaps these stones mark nothing more than a communal boundary, a gathering space for trade, a place where fishermen left offerings and thanks for good weather or calm waters. The sea has a way of making even simple functions feel sacred, especially after centuries of stillness have settled on them. Yet we speak it plainly. Ordinary life, after all, is the truest architect of the ancient world. We imagine a scholar, one of us, perhaps, in another lifetime, kneeling beside these stones when the land was still dry. A linen-bound notebook open, a charcoal stick worn blunt. The scholar might have been uncertain even then, might have written small notes like, stone axis unclear, or orientation possibly seasonal, or function indeterminate. In the margin, a softer comment, beautiful shadows. We rest on that phrase. It feels right for this place. Another theory, quieter still, glides into our shared thought, that the stones were placed for sound. Megaliths on land, in wind, hum in certain weathers. Underwater, their voices are different. We let ourselves drift until our ear, or the idea of our ear, comes close to the surface of one stone. Instead of a hum, we hear only the muted world heartbeat of the sea. But we can imagine, can't we, a time when these stones faced the wind and sang in low, patient tones that carried across the dry shoreline. Perhaps the builders listened to those voices. Perhaps they placed the stones in ways that complemented the breeze or the shape of the valley behind them. The sea has quieted those voices now, but quieting is not erasing. We do not conclude. Instead, we gather all these threads gently, alignments, tides, gatherings, sound, and fold them back into the steady rhythm of underwater light. The stones do not explain themselves, and we do not force them to. The final theory we entertain is the softest of all, that the circle exists simply because someone, long ago, felt moved to create a shape that pleased the eye, the hand, the mind. A circle is a comforting form. It encloses, it invites, it repeats itself without beginning or end. Perhaps someone stood on this shore millennia ago, looked at the calm sweep of the land, felt the wind ease across the plain, and thought, here, a circle. Here, let us place something that will remain. And the sea, patient as always, later agreed. We hover there a moment longer, the theories drifting around us like a school of slow, luminous fish, each one gentle, none insisting on itself. We release them back into the water and feel the calm they leave behind, the simple, restful pleasure of possibilities. And with a slow exhale, we move on. We lower ourselves again, slowly, until the larger circle of stones fades into a soft periphery and a single shape draws our full attention. The way a familiar face in a crowded room might suddenly become the only point of warmth we can see. The water settles around us with a hush, a kind of submerged sigh, and we drift close enough that the grain of the stone becomes a landscape of its own. Here, just beneath your left hand, the surface is uneven, a tapestry of tiny ridges softened by centuries of tidal patience. When we bring our fingers near, not touching, only sharing the water, we feel an almost imperceptible coolness radiating from the stone's mass. It is as though the temperature carries memory, deeper cold at the heart, a faint warmth where light grazes the edges. A small thread of sand shifts along the base, granular, whisper-light, the sound no louder than a thought sliding across the mind. We watch it move in a slow spiral, each grain pausing before settling again. And in that simple motion, something inside our own breathing loosens, softens, settles. There, just there, a chip in the stone's flank reveals a different texture. It is paler than its surroundings, almost like bone. Our eyes linger, tracing the curve of the fracture. Was it made by a tool? By a storm? By the gentle but inexorable pressure of settling earth long before the sea arrived? We do not answer. Instead, we let the question drift, a bubble rising slowly toward the surface until it disappears into light. Another detail appears as we shift our angle, a slender groove, no thicker than a piece of twine, cutting a shallow path along the stone's face. We follow it with a careful gaze, imagining how a rope might once have run here. The thought brings with it a small, steady intimacy, the sense of human hands tying something firm, practiced, familiar. It is a curious fact that even the faintest evidence of touch across centuries can feel like companionship, as though someone who lived and breathed and hoped once stood here, their movements echoing faintly through the water to meet us now. A tiny living anemone has anchored itself in the lower curve of the groove. Its pale tentacles open and close with the slowness of an old door in gentle wind. A soft unfurling, a soft retreat. We lean closer to watch, held by its rhythm. A creature so small, yet so patient, becoming the caretaker of a mark left by a person long vanished. Such continuity is a kind of lullaby. To our right, near the base, a pebble rests half buried in a pocket of stone. At first it seems unremarkable, until the current shifts and it gives the softest clink, a tiny, rounded sound like a bead touched lightly in a quiet room. That faint noise feels impossibly intimate underwater, as though the past whispered something only we were meant to hear. We let the silence spread again, vast, gentle, and we drift even closer. Now the stone's surface fills our entire world. The barnacles dotting it resemble constellations, pale and irregular, each one a small statement of persistence. Among them, a single worm track weaves a looping script across the stone's face, an accidental calligraphy shaped by a creature unaware of its artistry. We read nothing literal in it, yet something in its winding softness tells us that time writes in many alphabets, most of which do not require words. A faint echo reaches us, not from the stone, but from within it, perhaps, as the water presses and withdraws in slow pulses. It does not sound so much as suggestion, a sense of interior space, of weight. We place our awareness there and feel our own breathing slow again, matching the stone's long exhale, its long inhale, the steady, tidal patience of its being. If we turn slightly, just a few degrees, we can see a line where algae have formed a shy border. The green is muted, almost translucent, and forms a delicate edge where light lingers longer. It reminds us of moss on an old step leading to a forgotten garden. And suddenly, this submerged world does not feel foreign. It feels lived in. It feels continuous with the gentle domesticity we imagined earlier, the small rituals of hands, and rope and shared spaces. We reach the closest point now, and the water between us and the stone thins to a sheet of quiet clarity. Here, we study a single thumbprint of algae, a tiny oval of darker green where currents have coaxed growth into a shape almost human. The resemblance is accidental, but it carries the same melancholy tenderness as finding a pressed flower in an old book, a sign of life, preserved where no one expected it. From the west, a slow-moving trail of bubbles drifts toward us. They rise from a fissure low on the stone's hidden side, likely trapped air from earlier tides, or perhaps from a pocket formed when the ground settled ages ago. Each bubble ascends with a soft wobble, catching light in a way that resembles distant lanterns drifting upward on a night breeze. We watch them pass, one by one, and allow our thoughts to rise with them. When the bubbles fade, a deeper stillness returns. We let ourselves remain close, truly close, so the stone seems less an artifact and more a presence, a companion in the water, something old enough and quiet enough to teach us how to slow our hearts to match the tempo of centuries. And just like that, we realize the intimacy of the moment, how distance has dissolved, how observation has become a kind of shared breathing, how the ancient and the present have leaned together so gently they no longer press against one another but drift as one. We let that awareness hold us. And with a soft inward motion, we drift back just enough to see the stone hole again. The details settle into memory. Our bodies loosen further. Our breaths grow quieter. And the world around us dims into a pleasant, companionable hush. There is a moment, as we hover just above the stone's gentle crown, when the world around us loosens, the edges soften, and our thoughts begin to drift with the same unhurried ease as the tide itself. It is in this softened suspension, this easy blue between intention and dreaming, that small, wandering stories begin to rise. Not the kind meant to instruct, only those that hum quietly beneath the mind's surface, like the muted light of lanterns moving in fog. One such lantern appears now in memory, pale, bobbing, its light distorted by the weave of water and distance. I am put in mind of an old fisherman. I forget his name, though I remember the shape of his hat, who once told us that, as a child, he would sit on the wooden jetty counting the stones beneath the shallow tide. Not the stones themselves, but the way the tide blurred them, so they became soft circles of gray and green shifting gently with the wind. He said he liked the idea that some of those stones were older than the village, older than the stories told beside the harbor lamps. Under the slow blue, under the stones, that phrase was part of his childhood song, wasn't it? A lullaby almost too simple to be remembered, yet carried in the bones. He said his grandmother sang it when storms loosened the thatch and rattled the shutters. A song about the sea holding old memories, not taking them away. We drift with the words now, letting their repetition open the smallest of doors inside us. A door not meant for clarity, but for rest. The lantern drifts further, softening, and another tangent arises, gentle as a cloth drying in a salt breeze. In one village along this coast, the name lost to time, or to my imperfect recollection, a child once tied a small bell to a reed and anchored it just beyond the tittle line. Each morning the bell would chime once, faint and high, when the first wave touched it. The villagers said it marked the border between waking and dreaming, that whoever heard it would be granted a day with fewer worries. Under the slow blue, under the stones, we let that small bell ring again in our minds, one clear note suspended in all this water. It lingers longer than it should, perhaps because sound behaves differently here, or because the mind chooses to stretch it the way it stretches memories. Another drift, a soft one, like the bow of a boat nudging through green water. I recall a scrap of a tale about a girl who collected smooth pebbles and kept them in a cloth pouch. She believed the sea whispered to stones that had been carried far enough, so she would hold one to her ear, the way others hold shells, and listen for a quiet hum, as though the stone were remembering every place it had passed. Some say she could tell a stone's history from those hums. Others say she simply had a kind heart and liked imagining things. Either way, her story steadies us. There is something soothing in the idea that even the smallest pebble might carry its own soft biography, a wandering, unhurried one. Under the slow blue, under the stones. We return again to that phrase, as though it were a gentle mooring line, keeping us close to the slow rhythm of this place. It repeats without urgency, without direction, only as a tide-worn echo that gives the drifting mind a place to rest. Here, another image floats up, a boat rocking in a moon-dulled harbor, its ropes creaking in tiny, tender motions. The kind of sound one might hear in the earliest hours before dawn, when the village sleeps and the wind has nothing to do but soften itself against the water. The boat sways, left, right, a motion we feel in our own bodies now, even suspended as we are beneath these quiet waves. Under the slow blue, under the stones. Strangely, the deeper we drift into these small tangents, the closer we feel to the stones themselves. Not as puzzles to solve, but as companions in this gentle wandering. Their silent patience, their worn faces, their small pockets of algae and barnacles seem to welcome these drifting thoughts, as if the stones, too, have listened to countless small stories carried through tides and centuries. Another soft detour rises, the memory of lanterns again, this time hung from the masts of boats just before they pushed out for evening fishing. The light would flicker across the water, catching tiny insects in its glow. Some fishermen said these insects were good luck. Others said nothing at all, content to let the silence of the water carry their worries away. Silence. Light. The slow sway of boats. Under the slow blue, under the stones. We follow these small images without effort. They unwind themselves naturally, like loose threads in a well-loved shawl. Each tangent circles back to another, forming soft loops rather than lines. There is comfort in their circularity, in how they return, again and again, to calmness rather than meaning. Here is another, a story about an old woman who used to leave offerings of herbs, thyme, sea lavender, and a pinch of salt, at the edge of a tidal pool. Not as devotion, she said, but as gratitude for the sea keeping her secrets. The offering would dissolve by morning. She liked that, and so do we. The dissolving, the softening, the ease of things returning to water, under the slow blue, under the stones. Another soft detour rises, the memory of lanterns again, this time hung from the masts of boats just before they pushed out for evening fishing. The light would flicker across the water, catching tiny insects in its glow. Some fishermen said these insects were good luck. Others said nothing at all, content to let the silence of the water carry their worries away. Silence. Light. The slow sway of boats. Under the slow blue, under the stones. We follow these small images without effort. They unwind themselves naturally, like loose threads in a well-loved shawl. Each tangent circles back to another, forming soft loops rather than lines. There is comfort in their circularity, in how they return, again and again, to calmness rather than meaning. Here is another, a story about an old woman who used to leave offerings of herbs, thyme, sea lavender, and a pinch of salt, at the edge of a tidal pool. Not as devotion, she said, but as gratitude for the sea keeping her secrets. The offering would dissolve by morning. She liked that, and so do we. The dissolving, the softening, the ease of things returning to water, under the slow blue, under the stones. It is in the quieter distances, the ones we drift into almost accidentally, that time begins to fold in on itself, not abruptly, not like a door slamming shut, but with the gentleness of fabric sinking under its own weight. Down here, the sea carries no clock. There is only the slow tilt of light, the patient trembling of currents brushing ancient edges, and the sense that the present moment has grown wide enough to hold every age at once. We move toward a cluster of stones half hidden behind a curtain of drifting silt. They seem to lean toward each other as if sharing an old secret, one so weathered by centuries that even the sea has forgotten its original meaning. But the shape of the secret remains, like the faint impression left on a folded parchment long after the ink has faded. You don't need the words to feel the intention underneath. A soft back current presses against us, warm at first and then cooling, as if we are passing through layers of memory rather than water. Each layer changes the mood of the light: honeyed gold, then muted jade, then a blue so deep it seems to hum. These tonal shifts feel less like illumination and more like thought, the seabed remembering, reconsidering, drifting. One of the stones ahead is split neatly down its center, a clean fracture softened by centuries of marine life. Algae feather gently along the break, and tiny silver fish slip through it as though the crack were a doorway into a smaller, softer world. This quiet choreography, small bodies weaving through ancient wounds, becomes almost meditative. It reminds us that everything eventually breaks, and everything eventually finds a way to continue being part of the world anyway. As we glide over the fractured stone, the seafloor rises in a slow incline, and the currents steady into a barely there pulse. This pulse doesn't belong to the water. It belongs to the rhythm of age itself. It is the sound, if silence can be called sound, of eras settling into one another like sand. You feel it more than hear it. A steadying, a rounding of edges, a somber exhale that has been in motion longer than any living memory. In this softened part of the world, time is not something that passes. It is something that expands and gathers, like a veil being gently pulled across a story that never needed a conclusion. And as we hover in this layered quiet, the distinction between then and now begins to dissolve, not worryingly, not mysteriously, but with the comfort of realizing that all moments eventually touch. This is where the stones rest without urgency, and where we learn to drift at their pace. There comes a moment in every descent when sound itself feels like it is drifting away from you, stretching thinner, dissolving into the slow pulse of the sea. Here, in this muted basin between ancient stone arcs, we find that moment waiting for us like a lingering echo that has finally grown tired of traveling. Nothing around us moves quickly. The currents here curl in long, unhurried spirals, almost thoughtful in the way they pass along the edges of fallen lintels and half-buried columns. Each touch of water seems to polish the centuries, smoothing them into something quiet enough to hold without disturbing. It is as though the sea has decided to do the remembering for us, turning every echo of history into a whisper too gentle to draw us anywhere but inward. Ahead, where the soft gradient of light bends into a deeper cobalt, an arrangement of stones sits half-crescented around a shallow depression in the sand. Their alignment is imperfect now, tilted, settled, reshaped by the patient pressure of tides, but there's still a trace of symmetry lingering like an old melody. You can imagine people once gathering here, voices rising and falling in ways the wind no longer carries, intentions etched into the earth long before the water claimed it. As we drift closer, a faint shimmer of suspended sediment lifts from the seafloor, rising slowly like dust in a slanted beam of afternoon sunlight. The motion is so delicate it feels like thought rather than matter, like the sight itself exhaling after holding its breath for an age. The water thickens with this quiet haze, turning the space into something dreamlike, a threshold where memory and imagination become nearly indistinguishable. You can sense that whatever was spoken here, prayers, vows, stories, names, still lingers in the water's chemistry, softened into a kind of emotional residue. It doesn't reveal itself, doesn't demand interpretation, it only folds gently into the rhythm of the tide, a long echo stretched thin across centuries. We hover above the shallow depression, letting the slow swirl of currents settle around us. The sea seems to cradle the stones in a loose, old embrace, protective but serene. It is in this almost weightless stillness that the echo reveals its shape. Not a sound, not a message, but a calm reminder that everything once held dearly eventually becomes part of a larger, quieter continuity. Here, beneath shifting tides, echoes don't fade. They simply learn to rest. You can sense that whatever was spoken here, prayers, vows, stories, names, still lingers in the water's chemistry, softened into a kind of emotional residue. It doesn't reveal itself, doesn't demand interpretation, it only folds gently into the rhythm of the tide, a long echo stretched thin across centuries. We hover above the shallow depression, letting the slow swirl of currents settle around us. The sea seems to cradle the stones in a loose, old embrace, protective but serene. It is in this almost weightless stillness that the echo reveals its shape. Not a sound, not a message, but a calm reminder that everything once held dearly eventually becomes part of a larger, quieter continuity. Here, beneath shifting tides, echoes don't fade. They simply learn to rest. To our left, a gradual slope descends into deeper blues, and along its surface a faint geometry emerges, lines that intersect with the quiet deliberation of ancient planners. It could be the ghost of an avenue, a ceremonial path, or a terrace that once overlooked a village now given wholly to the tide. Whatever it was, the ocean has chosen to keep its identity soft, more suggestion than answer. And we accept this willingly. Down here, ambiguity feels like kindness. As we hover above these submerged coordinates, a strange sensation rises, almost like recognition, though we know it cannot be personal. Perhaps it is simply the shared human instinct to make sense of place, to feel the echo of footsteps where footsteps once were. Even the fish seem to respect the geometry, weaving their unhurried routes along the same invisible lines, moving with the patience of creatures who have accepted the sea's long memory. What we trace here is not a definitive map, but a gentle one, a map that invites us not to solve the mystery, but to drift through it. And in drifting, we become part of the quiet record the tides keep, a small notation written in the soft ink of passing presence. There comes a moment, down in the quiet blue, when the world no longer feels divided between sea and air, between above and below. Everything becomes one slow rhythm, one long exhale that seems to continue even after the breath has ended. We settle into that softness now, letting the last traces of daylight dim into a gentle, luminous hush. The stones beneath us rest without expectation. They have carried their mysteries for so long that they no longer ask to be understood. They simply are, patient, unhurried, softened by centuries of tide. And as we float above them, something in us mirrors that patience. Shoulders loosen, thoughts lengthen. The voice inside grows quieter, lighter, almost buoyant. A slow shimmer of plankton drifts through the water like a pale constellation, each tiny flicker rising and falling with the tide's slow breath. They move with such serenity that the mind naturally falls into step, letting images blur around the edges. The sea becomes a cradle, rocking with the gentlest imaginable sway, forward, back, forward, back. In this softened space, familiar images return like companions. The warm lamp from earlier in our journey, its glow barely pulsing. The arc of the tide encircling the stones. The map folded with ceremonial care. The hush of linen pages touched by salt. All drifting, all loosening, all fading into comfort. Even the water sounds change. What once whispered now murmurs. What once murmured now hums. A single tone, deep and slow, lies underneath everything, steady as a heartbeat, ancient as the seabed. It is the kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention. It simply holds you, the way dusk holds the last traces of day. The narrator's voice, too, begins to soften, words slowing until they feel like small lanterns released onto a calm surface. Each one floats for a moment, glows, and drifts away. Stones tide, warm lamp. Stones tide, warm lamp. The mantra grows gentler each time, its edges dissolving in the water like ink that knows it is ready to rest. There is nothing left to interpret now, nothing left to gather, nothing left to hold. Only the soft pull of the sea, the familiar comfort of breath, and the feeling of drifting, 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 into an easy, welcoming sleep.